You know, you start with some seeds, you hand your business cards out to people, talk to some folks, and you know, you're part of their life suddenly. But you might not start working for them until 3 or 4 years down the road.
Hey there, everybody. Matt here. Hope you're all having a great day so far. I'm really excited about the conversation I recently had with composer and sound designer Emmanuel Lagumbay. We run in a lot of the same circles online, and I'm a big fan of his stuff, and he really just brought a ton of value in this talk. He likens the working composer to a farmer, which is probably the most helpful metaphor I've ever heard on the topic. He'll unpack that in a minute. He talked through a massive game project he just wrapped up and his composition workflow for that, as well as some practical, nitty-gritty wisdom for succeeding in the honestly very saturated market of video game composing. Of all my podcast episodes, I genuinely think that this one is the most helpful for entry-level composers looking to move into the space. So if that's you, don't go away and enjoy this conversation with Emmanuel Lagumbay. So if you could just explain to me from the beginning what made you want to devote so much of your life to making video game music, because obviously I know you have a formal education in music, lots of different ways and directions you can take that. So I'm curious, what is it about video game music that made you want to kind of go into this field?
I think it's just because I spent so much time around it, having played games all my life and starting. Well, I think I know like the turning point on when it was like, oh, I really want to do this. Well, that was in college when I took courses in like computer science and the like. I wanted to work in games. I wanted to do all that stuff. And then I took a course on calculus. And totally, I think that was like my lowest grade ever. It was like a D- or something, and barely even scraping past the F. And I was like, yeah, I don't think I want to do computer science, but I was taking music courses. So I'm just going to stick in games and then continue to do music at the same time. For games. But what kind of inspired that? It was just a lifelong, experience of playing video games, always experiencing and hearing other people's works, primarily things like RPG music, Guild Wars. I grew up with Guild Wars, definitely. Like that was one of my first MMO experiences, actually probably my first MMO experience. And just hearing all those tracks, being inspired by that kind of stuff, being around that, the sights and sounds of games all my life.
So Guild Wars, would you say that's probably the one of the first games that really made an emotional impact on you as far as the music goes, or did you have any other sort of seminal moments as a kid where the composers or the music kind of just really made an impact on you?
I think Guild Wars is probably the first one I really just started to pay attention to the most. Because I mean, I had listened to, everyone knows all the soundtracks of the classics like Mario and Tetris. And the like, but I think Guild Wars is probably the first one where I was like really paying attention to the music in the game and really experiencing that along with playing alongside all these other people. But what kind of emotion are we talking here? Like, are we talking like, what kind of emotion are we talking here?
Well, that's a great question. I actually hadn't even thought of it. I guess it can be really any emotion. If you have multiple emotions that I would love to hear about, like, the different emotions. Well, I mean, like, I guess like rage quitting a really hard game, that could technically be an emotion. So I'm curious, any emotional impact really
that music has had on me. Okay. Well, for Guild Wars, like, it was probably one of my first, like, again, investments into the music of game audio.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it didn't have like, this really relatable feel to me. Like it was very good music. I enjoyed being immersed in that world. But I think when I started to really feel like an impact was not until I was a little bit older, and probably World of Warcraft and Guild Wars 2 started to have like that emotional connection where they're telling the storyline that's more relatable, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah.
So to pick a track, I'll stick with Guild Wars because it's Jeremy Soule, same composer. But Guild Wars 2, Fear Not This Night, is probably one of my most like emotionally connected pieces, just because it talks a lot about like, hey, everything's going to be fine. It's going to be, don't worry about it. Fear not this night. You will not go astray. No matter how bad it gets, you're still going to make it out of there. And like that really hit hard. Probably going out of college. I mean, even though I was listening to that in college, like going out of college, that really hit hard because there's a lot of stuff that was going on during that. Relative to my life. So being emotionally connected to that on top of other tracks, like still Invincible from World of Warcraft is probably one of my favorites of all time. Just because it again has that feel and connection to a character that's something, somewhat relatable to what I can see, where there's a guy that kind of Arthas loses himself a little bit, and they sing the song about maybe his horse or maybe about him. So it's one of those things where he ends up losing his horse because he pushes it too far. And it's kind of the same thing, kind of what do you call it? A mirror to himself, where he pushes himself too far and kind of loses them. So they're paying homage to this king in that song. And it just had that emotional connection of like the storyline combined with, amazing chord progressions and like great lyrics and just a lot of different feelings that kind of go all into one thing.
Man, that's really interesting because it's rare that I hear about game music making an impact on someone with lyrics, but it is incredible when I see game music that features lyrics if it's done well, and just
Yes.
how powerful that can be, because it's rare, right? You don't often see it, but there was that game, and it's the title and the composer are escaping me, so I'm totally useless right now. But it's the game where it's kind of like you're playing soccer. It's an indie game, and it was made by the guy. It's like a folk song, and they sing. It's like Shrine
Pyre.
something. Yes.
Is it Pyre?
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah,
Pyre.
Darren Korb. Yeah.
Yes, and that is incredible. And I love the way they do that. The way it's like didactic music from the game that's like a folk song, telling the story of the characters and stuff. And that's
so
really
bad.
cool.
I haven't played like the games that Darren works on. Let's Bastion, Transistor, and that Pyre. Like they all have that great lyrical feel to it. Like they all have because he's got great singers and great talent and great songwriting abilities. So it's just like everything goes super well together. But I honestly haven't played. I think I've only played a little bit of Bastion. I haven't played the other two, but I've listened to the soundtracks, and I've enjoyed the soundtracks immensely because they're just so, like you're saying, impactful.
So I take it that a lot of these, when you say Guild Wars and World of Warcraft, you kind of have a favor toward epic fantasy, maybe orchestral style music. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean it's just like I've always been immersed in the band world and the orchestra world. Like I played trumpet and French horn for my school years, so I've always been like immersed in the orchestral classical sense of things all my life, pretty much. Like my brother-in-law would always have me listen to John Williams and Hans Zimmer back in the day, and Klaus Badley and what's his name, Basil Poldoris. So like all the film composers.
That's really cool. Orchestral music is one of those things that is not really, I'm not quite familiar with it, and I've been fascinated by it ever since starting this podcast and talking to like Gordy Habb, who did the Battlefront soundtrack, and Gary Scheinman, who did who's done so much stuff. He's been composing longer than I've been alive, handwriting scores. And I'm just so foreign to that world, but I find it so interesting. So I love talking with guys like you who kind of grew up in that. So I'm curious, kind of transitioning over to your personal composition process. When you sit down to write a tune, like I know you just finished up a pretty big project, which I absolutely want to hear about. Actually, let's go ahead and we can just talk right about that. So VentureVerse, that's the project you've finished up, or at least I saw the trailer got released. So when you're sitting down to write a song for that, can you walk me through your workflow? Where do you start? Where do you get ideas? How much comes from the reference songs from the client and, kind of from your own brain? Maybe just tell a story of of your workflow on that project.
And that project, I was very lucky. Matt Kapner is the lead designer and basically the one-man army for this entire project. And usually it depends on the track in particular. Like if I'm doing a main theme track, I'll usually be given some kind of reference as to what it should kind of feel like. In this case, there was a lot of like Legend of Zelda influencing the sound of everything. But he's given me a lot of free reign. Honestly, it's very very. It's nice to have that kind of trust with a client where you can just he'll give you a reference, or maybe he won't at all, and just say do your thing, and you can send him something and get the feedback from there. And I've been very lucky to be able to do that. I think the main theme will start with that, because that was probably the hardest one that I had to work with. I messed around on keyboard a lot. Like I would just take a couple of instruments. I knew that I wanted to write for a certain player for this particular one, Damien Wynn. He's an oboe player that played in the Summoners Orchestra with me when I made this live ensemble, and I knew that I wanted to have him kind of be featured for this. So I took an oboe library in my DAW, and I just started messing around. And I just like trying to figure out what typical feelings and typical leaps and what do you call it? Oh my god, what is the word? I'm blanking out on that stuff now. What is music theory? It's the typical intervals that you would want to have to kind of make a melody. So I was just messing around, doodling a little bit. Other times,
now, were you aware when you started composing? Were you aware of kind of the oboe's timbral qualities? Because I know in orchestral music, that's a huge area of expertise that you kind of grow in, is understanding. Okay, the oboe sounds this way when it's in this register, and it sounds this way in this register, and don't write this note on a page because the player will kill you because it's super hard to get there, that sort of thing. So how much of that did you have to take in consideration when you were writing for the oboe?
Oh, all of it. I again came from a band background, so I had that experience beforehand, but I had never played oboe. I'd never looked at oboe music. So it was very much just trial and error, studying and asking questions. Having a relationship with the instrumentalists you have on your tracks is definitely important. So you should be feeling comfortable to ask them, hey, is this doable? Like, is this something you can do? I don't like to just hand something to somebody and expect it to be amazing if they can't do it. So I like to talk with them and say, is this possible? I mean, I've done that through college and stuff when I had was writing stuff. My girlfriend's a piano player, and so I would write things for the choir there, and I'd send it to her first and be like, hey, can you play this on piano? Can you accompany this? And usually I get glaring looks of like, what the hell are you doing? But she makes it work. It's the same thing with some of the players where in this case I was asking him like, hey, is this in the good range for you? Did these notes work? And some people will tell me this key is better just because I can avoid this note a little bit more than others. And that kind of happened with the oboe. It was like, this note's not our best note. It was like a B flat, I think, if I remember correctly. It's not the best note in this register, but I can make it work. And so I said, well, thankfully it's a crescendo at this point, so it could sound a little bit dirty. It just it's going to get kind of pushed around while like a cymbal roll is happening. So it's just kind of knowing the instrument plus communicating with the person you're working with.
Yeah, that's really wise, because when I think about composing orchestral music, I think about having a finished piece, presenting it to players, and them basically throwing tomatoes at me and making a fool out of myself. But you don't even think about, well, hey, why don't you just be friends with them and shoot them music back and forth before you go into a recording session, basically say, hey, is this play? And like, for some reason that didn't even cross my mind. So I think that's a huge takeaway, for composers that do want to add live instruments, is just really open up those lines of communication, really be friendly and kind, and be as communicative as possible with, don't just present a finished product and say, okay, please send me the recording when you're done, say, hey, how does this sound in this register? So I think that's really wise, man. So, okay, so you're messing around with your oboe patch and you've kind of got a cool melody lined up. How then do you proceed with, fleshing it out with other instrumentation?
A lot of just trial and error at that point, because like orchestration is, in a sense, is what happens after that. It's all for those that don't really know what orchestration is. It's basically taking a couple lines of music and feeding it to an entire orchestra to kind of fill in the sounds and the like. So I could, like, let's say have this melody line and one bass line, and that's all I have. But now I've got 60 instruments that I could work with, or 15, 20 instruments I could work with, and making it work around that, and adding chords and adding a little bit more structure to it. So I usually start with like a couple of chords. So once I have my melody, I try to figure out what chords work with it, or vice versa. Maybe I have my chords first, and then I like to work around the melody after. And I pick instruments that I think would fit that timbre. So in this case, the main theme is going to be like very victorious, very adventurous. So a full orchestra is, the right palette in the sense. So I think I took my strings next, and I gave it a very like padded feeling. So I had the strings play like a lot of long notes to kind of emphasize things, and maybe some trills here and there from like other wind instruments. Brass instruments are very powerful and attacky. So those ones are kind of backing up the oboe sound. But when for this particular project for VentureVerse, the oboe took the lead. So everything else was totally just secondary to the oboe. Very much just pads or a little bit of percussion. I think the percussion is kind of the next part of the feature for the main theme, which just because I love having good rhythm, good different rhythm. And I will say that this took a lot of iteration because John Metz, who is also another composer, excellent composer, is one of my go-tos for asking for feedback. Just like, hey, what does this sound like? And his number one response for almost a lot of my older projects was the percussion is too similar. Like it's just repeating. Like you can do way more with it. So I tried to take a very big percussion take on this one, and he finally approved it at the end. It was like, yeah, finally, I think this is the right thing, and that felt very good to finally get his approval on percussion part.
That's really cool that you're also going to other composers for feedback. When you're orchestrating, it does seem less overwhelming, right? When you start from, you have your melody and your bass line, or maybe your harmony in mind. Do you go, down in score order and say like, okay, how do I want to orchestrate the winds here? Or is it very much just like, okay, I hear brass chords here. Do you kind of hear it in your head and move to the instrument that you hear in your head? How do you, in other words, you have your 60 instruments, like you mentioned, which one do you choose first?
Oh, that totally changes from piece to piece. But I do have some favorites. Like I do like to work with brass because I was a brass player. So if the piece calls for brass, I usually will try to start with them and figure that out. If that's not working out, I will move to strings because I usually like to add an ostinato, like a repeating rhythmic pattern that kind of pulsates underneath. So I would go to them instead and do the ostinato with the strings. And then maybe the brass doubles it or does something different on top. So it varies.
I think the key, like you said, is just a lot of trial and error, right?
Honestly, yeah, there's not really. I mean, there are like obviously tried and true tests that you could use and methods that people have done in the past. But when you're doing something, I think in this kind of creative caliber, it's like one day it'll work, and then the next day you find something better, and then you completely scrap that and you change what you did the first day into the new thing. So it totally depends.
I'm curious if you could just run me through, what are some libraries that you really like? What DAW do you prefer for composition? And also resources, like it could be books, it could be Facebook groups, like all the groups that, I know we run in very similar groups. Business skills for composers, what have you. What are just some, besides, your DAW, maybe books, maybe libraries, Facebook groups, what are some key resources that you turn to over and over throughout the composing process?
Okay, so in terms of hardware or software, we'll start with that. I've been using Cubase 6.5 for like the last 5-6 years now, I think. That's just been what I've got. Like I can't really afford to upgrade at this point yet. I'll get there eventually and get to whatever it is now. It's like 9 or 10. But I prefer that for composition just because I've been using that for 5 or 6 years now. Before then, I used to compose in Finale, which I actually might try doing again, where I start with the score and then put that into a DAW and then make the mock-up from there. Which I feel more comfortable seeing notes and understanding the notes than I do piano roll, if that makes sense, just because I played music all my life.
No, it makes total sense.
That said, the piano roll works out okay. In terms of libraries, I use Cinebrass. cinematic strings. Those are like my go-tos. As much as I bash on East West Quantum Leap for their long load times, they have great libraries. I can't really deny that. Um, they have great drum libraries, which I primarily use. I use them for woodwinds as well. So like Storm Drum, Raw, their choirs I've been using, and they're like, I think I only have their gold version of their orchestra, symphonic orchestra stuff, and that's worked out all this time. I also have like things like Omnisphere, which I use for like more electric sounding things or some effects that they have.
Hmm.
Um, I think that sums up a lot of the tools I have in terms of like mixing. There's so many different plugins you have.
Oh, of course.
It's just a matter of using which ones you know are comfortable with using at that point. Like
Sure.
any of them really work. It's
Yeah.
just understanding how to get the best out of those particular things. And this is the same for the sample libraries. Like there's a billion that are going to be out there, and there's a billion more that I still want to get at some point in my lifetime. But you know, use what you have is my suggestion, and
Absolutely.
figure out how to make that work for you. If it's not like if you can't think about it necessarily based on the quality of your libraries, you can think about it based on the composition itself. Because if you have a good composition, you can make that sound awesome for whatever setting it is. That
That's
said,
so true.
you know, libraries do help a little bit, but it is an investment. So it's if you're not there yet, which I don't consider myself there yet either. Work with what you've got, figure out how to make that work, and then eventually, you know, you might upgrade, but you'll also find yourself using the old stuff too. Like I guarantee that.
I was going to say, just a comment. I think that's been a very common thread throughout all my interviews. Is I interviewed the Marcato Bros, and Carl went so far as to say gear does not matter at all. He was very adamant about that. And I don't know if
Yeah.
I would go that far, but I do agree. The more and more I talk to composers, that limitations and restraints are not like a stumbling block for composers. If anything, they're a catalyst for creativity, because you're forced to think inside of what you have. And I think I heard it said, it's kind of like an RPG or like Pokemon, where like if you're not high enough a level, your Pokemon's not going to listen to you because you're not ready.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's sort of I've heard it said, and it's a very apt metaphor. Like if you're a composer for games, you need to like work your way up to those massive libraries and the insanely expensive gear. Because I'll watch YouTube videos of pro composers, and they have this room full of synthesizers, and I'll get all FOMO and like, man, what am I doing? But then I'm like, they worked hard and bought the one at a time. They earned that over time. And I think that if we're faithful to the craft, that we can earn it over time. It's a matter of being patient. So just a quick affirmation of what you said. I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, like, it doesn't. You're always going to want to splurge on stuff for that newest library or that newest job.
Sure.
But like I said, I've been using Keybase 6.5 for the last 5 or 6 years, and I just got Reaper. I haven't used it for composition very much.
I love Reaper.
Try a couple things. Yeah, it's an excellent DAW. And how much is it for like the small
$60?
business?
It is cheap.
I think I paid 75 if I remember correctly.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, but it's less than $100. Like it's still
that's insane.
It does everything you needed to do, and I've definitely paid it off with just a couple of sound design projects I've done for it. I love it for sound design. It's excellent because every channel is an aux port. Basically, you can just stick as many different little things on it. It's just so easy to get things going on it. So I as you know, I'm part of Business Skills for Composers. Excellent resource. They've got a lot of great people on there that are very informative. And it's very open. Like if you have any question, is generally going to be answered. As as dumb as you may think it is, it's not a dumb question because there's so many variables to what we do.
Sure.
On top of that, there's the Game Audio Denizens, which is probably another place I go to for like, I asked one of my first questions there for sound design, asking about like, hey, how do I even price myself as a sound designer for games?
Yeah.
And then I got, great feedback there. I'm also part of the Game Audio Network Guild, or GANG.
Oh, nice.
Very, very great resource because there's a lot of people there. They're starting to revamp a lot of stuff to kind of get things moving a little bit more. So there's a lot of things like, what do you call it? Articles or videos and tutorials. just a bunch of like again, and once since it is a guild in a sense, it's a lot of people that you can talk to and make friends with and ask them questions, which I think is basically where I got a lot of my information from. Going to conferences and meeting friends, those are probably like some of your number one resources that you can ask, like just get some feedback from, people you trust. For the longest time, I was getting feedback from friends that don't necessarily know the craft, but they know me and they know music a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lot of just generalizations. So it's like, oh, this sounds good, or this sounds great, or maybe this is a little loud.
Mm-hmm.
But like that's good feedback when you're starting out. But you want to find stuff where you can get like friends that are in the industry that you can trust, friends that understand the workflow of things. Just talking to them and being like, hey, what does this sound like? And you'll get stuff like, hey, you need to EQ this frequency range a little bit for this instrument, or maybe the chord progression you have there could be a little bit different. Instead of going to this chord, go to this chord. You get very more detailed stuff rather than, oh, that sounds good, or that sounds all right. Like that's good stuff to have for the beginning, but if you want to grow, you definitely need a lot more detailed information.
So what you're saying is it's important as you're networking, not just to think networking with devs for gigs, but also networking with other composers so that you can have that community, but also that feedback loop of where you're actually getting quality feedback from other people who know the craft.
Absolutely. I think it's a 2-for-1, to be honest, because most of my gigs, I think almost all of my gigs, maybe bar one or two of them that I've gotten in the last 2 or 3 years, have been through referrals from other composers or other audio designers. It's just, it is a community in the end. It's very much a community. And when you talk to them, if you're not approaching them like you're somebody just hunting for a gig, but you actually want to talk to them and be friends, because that's actually a good thing to have. Sure. It changes the perspective on everybody. Like I didn't intend to talk to you a long time ago, expecting to get interviewed for a podcast. We talked about, I think the reason I contacted you is because I wanted to do a remix of Sebastian when you did his interview. Yeah. So that's how I talked, that's how I got introduced to you. Metadata. Exactly. So like, I never intended to, get a job for you or talk about something on a podcast. And here we are now.
Right. Absolutely. I think, man, to a certain extent, you have to like people, because the thing is unfortunately, not unfortunately, but maybe unfortunately for introverts, or we can't just go into a cave with our MIDI keyboard and our DAW and make a living. We have to go out into the world and see people. And I think it's an advantage of people like you and myself, where I genuinely love making friends. I just love talking to people, making new friends. And I think if you have that in this space, you'll go far.
Yeah, I'll second and echo that. That said, I have had some experience just cold emailing developers, but that changes nothing. You're still, even though you're not face-to-face or you're not talking to them verbally, you are still in contact with them and you're trying to meet them and, network with them. But I think the approach should still be very much, not necessarily business first, but just interest first. Because no one really likes that person that walks up to you and is like, hey, here's my business card, and has zero other words for you. It's just,
we've all been to those networking events and things like that.
I was that person. I can't say I wasn't that person when I first started out, because that's very much how, you think when you're not sure about the customs or the culture of how that kind of works. You think my first thing is I need to leave with a job, and that's your goal and your mission. So you're just throwing out business cards like they're dollar bills everywhere. Everyone's trying to pick them up. That's just, it's not a very good way to do things, because you want to build and actually nurture and cultivate great relationships, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, this is kind of off the cuff, but I've been doing some research and just sort of developing this gut feeling that composers are, for lack of a better phrase, kind of becoming the used car salesman of the game world, because it's almost as if there are so many of us that it's just lost. Sometimes we can just get lost in a sea of, composer, trying to hunt for the same client or fight for the same client, or clients getting bombarded with 20 emails a day saying, hey, I'm a composer.
Yep.
I've seen forum posts, I've seen Facebook groups where these devs will just say like, oh yeah, by far the most emails I get looking for work are from composers. So it's like, how do we overcome that? Can we overcome that? I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it is definitely a numbers game, because there's less need for composers than there are, like, let's say, artists or programmers. And if you have multiple artists, you can have multiple artists on a game, but it's very rare to have multiple composers.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point.
So number wise, you're going to have 8 people, or not even 8, I'm going to say 80 plus people going for one gig. Whereas other places, they're going to be hiring 4 or 5 of the same gig, so that there's a better what do you call it, ratio, if that makes ratio is probably the word I would use there, like a better ratio of people that are applying for it than people that are needed. To overcome that, it's tough, because it's one of those things where it's like you have to do that, everybody's got to do it, but at the same time, I do think the attitude should again be to cultivate a relationship first and let the work come secondary. Whenever I've cold emailed people, I usually don't even mention my music anymore, or my audio, period. I usually just express interest in the product, because if I want to work on something, it's because I'm interested in what they're doing, not necessarily just because I want their money, because that's not a good, healthy way to look into things.
Sure.
So I don't even mention my, this is what I do. I say, hey, this is a great game. Like, keep that up. It seems awesome. And I just,
so cool.
We'll keep going with that and see where that goes, and maybe shoot them a follow-up message, a month or 2 later, if they respond like, hey, thanks, that's great. Just to see where they're at, see what the update is. And eventually, if the timing is right and if the relationship is right, I will mention, yeah, I also do this. If you're interested in that, let me know. But chances are they might actually already have a composer, or they're an audio designer. And if they do, then, well, at least they have another name in the bank in case they wanted to go back to somebody, which that has happened in the past, where somebody said that I've got somebody for this, but I like your stuff. Maybe we'll work together later. And they, sure enough, half a year or so later, message me saying, hey, I've got this project. Do you want to take it on? We could use this kind of stuff.
That's really, really good advice. Sort of piggybacking on that, where I've heard really mixed opinions on this, and I'm sure it's different for every composer who's experienced this, but some composers are of the opinion that you should have a demo reel ready at all times that you can send. Where other composers I've talked to, and this is a perfectly valid opinion, say, no, don't do a demo reel. Don't send them a demo reel. Send them a song that you think would work with their game. A very specific sort of niche for their game. And then others yet have said, no, have a demo reel that is set to picture, like rescoring other people's games, rescoring other games. And so there's a lot of back and forth on that. I'm curious if you, in your experience, have found any of those methods to be more effective than the others.
All of them have worked for me, is what I will say.
Okay.
I have a demo reel. I just have a SoundCloud page with my top tracks that I think are representable of my abilities, and I stick that on my website. I don't expect people to actually sit and listen to it, to be honest. I'm not anticipating people are gonna really hire me off of this demo reel, because I'm usually networking with particular games. So I will, in general, send a track that's more specific to a title. Because let's say if somebody's doing Hello Kitty 3 or whatever, I'm not going to give them my epic death metal track, because it just doesn't make sense unless for some reason they're going to do that. And let's say that's my number one, the first song on my profile on my SoundCloud. If I'm applying for this kids game, I don't want them to hear me doing, burlesque music, if that makes sense.
Yes, so that's the first thing they're going to hear, and they could bounce away.
They're like, ooh, right. They're like, that doesn't make any sense. So I will try to cater it towards whatever my clientele is. If I'm looking for a specific, if they're looking for specific tracks, or the history of their games is very much along a certain genre, then I'll send them those kind of tracks. But I'll also, throw in another one or two. That said, I have had work, from just having a SoundCloud. Basically, is like somebody says, "Hey, this is great music. I saw I listened to your stuff on your portfolio. Do you want to work with me? Do you want to do this, that kind of stuff?" And as far as picture to scoring to somebody else's work, I haven't done that, but I have sound designed to others people's work,
Mm,
and that has actually gotten me most of my work in the last year or so.
that's
Where I did
awesome.
like a redo of the audio for Elder Scrolls Online,
Oh,
one of their
nice.
first trailers, their cinematic. Sorry, their first cinematic. I redid the sound design for some of their scenes, and I said that, like, for VentureVerse, I sent that exact scene to the developer. I said, "Hey, just so you know, I'm starting to do sound design. Let me know if you or anyone else might need something on top of music or whatever." And this is for VentureVerse. So I already had a working relationship with the guy, and the like. And he said, "I'm actually playing Elder Scrolls Online right now, and I like your sound design for it better than the original. So do you want
That is
to do
so
sound design for
cool.
VentureVerse?" So it's one of
That
those
is
things
so
where it's
cool.
like, yeah, it can work. It depends. I don't see why not. The only thing that would constrain that is time. Like, if you don't have time to do
Sure.
that, stick to what you think will work best. But again, all of them have actually worked for me.
That's really good to know. I'm curious, kind of touching back on the cold email thing, which is just a cool topic I enjoy talking about with
Mhm.
people. How many would you say, if you were to maybe break it down, how many gigs do you think that you have gotten through those relationships, maybe that started with the cold email versus maybe referrals? I'm sure you've gotten a lot more from referrals, because
Yeah,
obviously people trust the word of a good friend. But I'm curious
right.
how you found those to be successful, those cold emails.
It's very hard, I will say. I did this a lot last year, or maybe 2 years ago, more than I did have been doing recently. I tried to send 10 emails a day, basically, right?
Yeah.
To random developers, random people, projects that I felt interested in. And back then, it was even projects I didn't feel interested in. It was just, I'm looking for work. I was desperate to get
Anyone.
some money
Yeah.
in, that kind of thing. Yeah. Um, but my response rate, is probably about 5 or 6 responses out of 10 emails a day. Like, let's say a week. Let's go to
Okay.
70 emails a week. I might get 5 or 6 responses total in the entire month.
Oh, wow.
And then a couple of those might be, "Oh, we're interested," and then nothing else. And the rest are usually like,
Mm,
"No, we're good. We already have something." So it's very, very hit or miss. It's not something you do expecting great success in. It's something you do
sure.
just expecting to get the numbers down, and eventually something will happen.
Right.
There
Yeah.
was somebody that I had emailed, like, let's say the beginning of 2016, and I heard from them at the end of 2016 or maybe early 2017, saying, "Hey, I've got a project. Do you want to work on it?" So it was like literally no response for all this time, and then
Wow.
suddenly, "Hey, I've got a project for you," like, just randomly. So, like, it's hit or miss. Like, you never really know. And other
Yeah.
times, there are people that are like, "Hey, I can't use you for this project, but maybe I'll use you for a future one." And sure enough, half a year later or so, when they're working on their next gig, that's something that does come along. Just to go on the numbers, like, I honestly maybe gotten maybe 2 or 3 gigs total from my cold emailing, but I've actually since stopped doing that. In terms of just straight business, I'm starting to take again that relationship building kind of
Sure.
position, where I'm not necessarily asking them for work. I'm just cold emailing them to ask about their game and to kind of get some insight on what they do.
Yeah, that's really cool, man. I'm curious. I don't know if you told me, and if you did, forgive me. How did you meet the VentureVerse guys?
Oh yes, VentureVerse. So the main dev is in the UK, but this was actually a project I got as a referral from John Robert Metz, who couldn't take the project at the time. It just wasn't in his timeline to be able to make things work out. So he said, "Hey, you have any good fantasy music cues that you want to send my way, just so I can send it to this guy and see if he's interested?" And that's basically the start of that relationship, where I sent him a couple of fantasy cues. It turned out to be something that the Matt Kapner was interested in, and that was and the rest is history. At that point, everything's just kind of continued
Yeah.
from there.
If you didn't have those cues, because that's like that sounds like a nightmare, like my worst nightmare. Like someone says, "Hey, I have this gig for you, quick, send me this genre of music," and I'm like, "I don't have any." Did you have those in the holster, ready to go? From a previous project, or just from your own personal composition work?
Those were personal compositions. Like that's very like before I even started professionally, I was just writing music. It was kind of a hobby, just for fun. I didn't expect to actually
wait,
get
just
paid
for fun,
this.
writing music just for fun. What is
I know
this
who
you
does
speak
that.
of?
Who am I?
Right.
But I was very lucky to have that. But that said, I have had projects where they're like, "Hey, I might have a gig for you. Do you have anything like this?" And my answer is nope, but I will in however long I have to do this.
Sure,
So,
sure.
like if you have an hour or two to do that, like you got to do it in an hour or two, like just to have the chance of making it work. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it's all right.
I'm sure that
Now you have. If it doesn't, you have a thing for your portfolio at that point that you could show later.
Exactly. Yeah. Stephen Mullin, whom you know as well, he's fond of saying, "Don't let any piece of music go to waste." There's always some purpose for every piece of music. Whether it's a library or a portfolio or maybe another client down the road. I'm curious, with the cold emailing thing, I'm sure that you've run into some shysters because there are some sketchy devs out there. I talked a little bit about this with Taylor Ambrosio Wood, where she said, there'd be people that say like, all right, we're going to do a competition and you're going to work for free and you're, all this stuff. I'm curious if you've run into those and how kind of to avoid bad fits.
Well, in terms of the competition aspect, like I do understand that that's rough, like that you don't really want to view it as a competition, but demoing isn't abnormal. Where you send in, a track or they send you a test basically, and they're like, all right, let's see if you fit our vibe right, based on this exact test. So like that's not too abnormal, like especially when you're working with or trying to apply for AAA companies per se. Like they will listen to your portfolio sense. And then they'll send you a screen cap of the game and say, hey, can you score this or sound design this and see if that works out. And then that's technically a competition in a sense.
Sure.
That's all around. Like I see indies do that too, but you kind of to kind of see how things work is definitely you want to check their background in terms of like what projects they might have worked on before.
Sure.
Or even just see the project that's currently, that they're currently working on. Like how much has it developed? How are they progressing with things? Is it one of those things where it's like, I'm going to work for you for 2 months and then 6 months later, the game's no longer in development. And they're like, you never really know for sure. But you can kind of tell based on just the conversations you're having, like even on the way they email you back, if it's very, like, let's say I'm talking to somebody that's, a dev in the US, like, English speaking dev that works with this, but their email is just full of like errors and full of all these things, then that, okay, well maybe they're not organized in that sense. So I might have trouble dealing with payments or contracts and the like. But again, you never really know because sometimes everything's going to be perfectly fine. Like I've had a gig where English wasn't this person's best language. But I got paid on time. I got the information I needed to get the gig done. So it's kind of hit or miss. It's really hard to tell. But you will see some red flags every once in a while. Where like, I don't know if I really want to work on this because the way they're kind of treating me, or the way they're viewing my contract, or they're just so defensive about this and this.
I've heard a big thread, a common thread I've heard in my interviews is like when there's endless haggling over price, from the dev of just like they're really just trying to talk you down, like almost kind of to the point of like endless haggling. That might be, it's tough, because obviously maybe they're reasonable in their haggling, but when it gets to the point where you kind of have to make a judgment call and just say, okay, I don't think that you value sort of the value that I'm bringing as much as you should. So that's, it's a tough call. I imagine it's a tough call. A lot of it's got to do with probably, like you said, vetting them out, and also just just like a gut feeling.
To kind of piggyback on what you're saying, like you never, like when they're haggling prices, you know what you want, like when you're going into it. usually you should try to at least know the general feel that you want. Like you should try to deny anything that's going to get you below or an expectation, like a percentage of what you're getting, if that makes sense. Like if
Sure.
I'm asking for $1,000 a minute of music, or I'm giving them a package deal of 10 grand to score their game or whatever it is, but they're like, oh well, I can only give you $200 and I can't give you any back
Yeah.
end. That's when you're like, okay, well then no, I'm not going to do that because that's a waste of
Sure.
your time, a waste of my time,
Yeah,
that
that's
kind of thing.
grossly underpriced. Yeah.
Right. And then
Yeah.
part of it's education too, because like a lot of devs don't necessarily know the amount of time and the amount of
Hmm.
effort and like the expenses that we have to incur just to get a minute of music out. Um,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
that's a time thing. Like a lot of people don't quite understand that yet. They're like, oh, you should be doing this for free. Like, no, it's not how that works. Yeah.
So I think based on what we've talked about, it's clear that this is a competitive space.
Mhm.
And like all competitive spaces, it can be challenging for people who are new or who are aspiring composers to break into this space. So, given all the advice that you've already shared, which has been tremendous, and I really appreciate it, do you have any advice for people who are like, okay, it's 2018, I'm music, I'm a musician, I think I've got what it takes. How can I break into this space?
Um, Well, for one, I think the concept of breaking in is something that has to be kind of notched down from them, if that makes sense. Because
Okay.
there's no breaking in. Like you don't walk in the door, you don't slam it down, and you're like, "All right, I'm here." Um,
Hmm.
it's very much a long grind. You have to be ready to spend and do your time, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, you can't just like there's not like or I can't say there's not. It's very rare that somebody will just graduate college, have made zero relationships, and then have a career in games. Like it's
Oh
possible,
yeah.
I'm sure, but you have to do a lot of work just before that and even after that, just kind of making relationships and talking to people and just understanding how that works. And I would say I've been in the industry for about 5 years now. I'm only starting to see the fruit of all that time. So it's
Hmm.
taken about 5 years for things to kind of actually happen, for me to have built enough relationships and to cultivate those relationships. It's a lot like farming, like you plant some seeds and
Right.
then you wait
Yeah.
and you wait and you plant more seeds and you keep cutting and trimming and then stuff starts to grow. And then once that
Hmm.
plant is a little bit bigger, then you start trimming it a little bit more and you add like fertilizer. You change the fertilizer that you're having. And same
Sure.
thing
Yeah.
with building relationships in the industry is like you don't really know where to start. You start with some seeds. You hand your business cards out to people, talk to some folks, and you're part of their life suddenly. But you might not start working for them until 3 or 4 years down the road, which has happened to
Yeah.
me so many times that I can't even imagine. Like a lot of the relationships I built that first year are now offering me gigs that they might need, or they may need a secondary composer or sound designer for their project. And so those are things like those are friendships you kind of start with. And I think the best way to look at it is just uh, you're not just selling yourself, but you're totally selling yourself. So you have to be sincere to who you are, be sincere about what you want to do and what you want to work on, and
Sure.
also be very, very just for lack of a better phrase, don't be a
No,
like that's the
absolutely.
number one thing. Like that, the
Yeah.
people aren't going to want to work with you if you're just that soul that nobody really likes. If that um, makes things clear, but
That was
just
Chris
be a good
Madigan.
person.
That was his only advice. Like literally,
Oh, really?
that
Yeah,
was
that's
literally it.
that's really
And
it.
work hard.
Yep,
That was
I
those were the
will echo
two.
that completely
And I was like,
because
all
like
right, moving on.
yeah,
Here we go. Yeah, no, but
yeah,
it's
there's a
so
lot of
true,
people
man.
I've yeah, there's a lot of people I've tried to work with that I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to work with you again, or like I've seen how they work with other people. I'm like, well, I shouldn't, I know I'm not going to work with you, that kind of thing. And it's just because the attitude you have is a major either turn on or turn off. It depends on what it could be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, man, I really appreciate you taking the time out to chat. I want to end on one question by just asking you, what are you listening to lately? What have you been playing lately as far as games go? And what game soundtracks or music otherwise has been inspiring you lately?
Shoot. Okay, so what have I been listening to lately? I've actually had Discover. I use Spotify,
Discover
And then
Weekly.
my Discover Weekly, it is a godsend.
I love me some Discover Weekly, dude. They know me.
The best.
I feel like they read
Yeah.
my mail.
I know, right? They're basically like the Google, like they know everything about me. It's Spotify. They got my
crazy.
taste down down to the eighth note. But like
Nice.
I
like
will
that.
use I'll use Discover Weekly quite a bit, and I'll get some electronic music. I'm listening to a lot of I've actually been listening to a lot of EDM stuff, mostly by some contemporary friends that I have, like James Landino.
Oh, I
Uh,
love his stuff. I had him on
oh,
the
he's
show. He's
amazing.
fantastic.
Yeah. I had him. I first heard about this guy when we hired him for a DJ thing for an E3 event that we were throwing, and I've like fallen in love with this stuff since then. It's all great, and it's all like up my alley in terms of EDM. As far as orchestral stuff, like I like listening to the WoW soundtrack still, Overwatch stuff, like basically anything that's got like that epic blizzardy feel. I'm a fan of. I can't, I can definitely not go without saying that I'm listening to any League of Legends music, because like League of Legends music was my jam, still is my jam. Was super passionate about that. That's what made me start the Summoners Orchestra. Um, and let's see what else. Random movie film things here and there. Like I try to listen to some classical every once in a while just to kind of get my ear back into that, because that's where it all came from anyway.
Sure. Yeah.
What else? Yeah, that's pretty much it for the most part.
Cool, man. Well, that's awesome. I love Discover Weekly. I feel like
Yes.
whenever it refreshes, I'm always like, oh, what have you got for me this week? And it's always so interesting and it's dynamic, because I listen to a lot of different types of music. And so it might actually be like a folk song. And then right
Yeah,
after
right.
that, an electronic cover of an orchestral video game song. And
Yep,
I'm like, all right,
it's
you
always
know
the
me.
best. Yep, they have it on point. Like, oh, it's like a film soundtrack. Oh, it's like this random folk song. Oh, hey, look, another video game soundtrack. Oh, this is some
Yeah,
cool
it's
electronic
just
music. It's always great. Oh, and technically, it's a write off too, like because it's
that's
for work. Like, it's
true.
research, right? Yep.
benefit of doing this for a living, and I guess incorporating yourself. We could probably talk all about the legal implications
Oh,
of that,
jeez.
which is another black box. Maybe we'll save that for another chat.
Yeah.
But dude, I really appreciate you chatting with me. I think there have been so many little pieces of practical wisdom, both in the composing process and in the process of getting gigs, that I know I've learned from, and I know that people listening will as well. So if people want to learn more about you, people listening want to hear your stuff, reach out to you, maybe learn more about you, where should they go?
Well, basically, I've got one page on my website now. That's kind of my one go-to for all things, because I stopped using everything. But they can go to my website, lagumbaymusic.com, or they could also just shoot me an email. It's emman.lagumbay. It's emman.lagumbay@gmail.com. Like, if they want to talk or hear more about stuff, like, I'm more than happy to chat.
Well, thanks so much, man. I really appreciate you taking the time out to chat, and hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Of course. Thanks to you, and thanks for having me, man.
If you enjoy these interviews and want to support the podcast, honestly, the best way to do that is just to share this episode with a friend. Now, if you want to be a real mensch, you can rate the podcast on iTunes, which really helps, goes a long way for visibility. If you're listening on the Apple Podcast app, just scroll down and tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Follow me on Twitter at MattKenyonMusic and let me know what you think of the show. Until then, you've been listening to Composer Code, the podcast dedicated to helping you, dear listener, succeed as a video game composer. Take care.